History as it happens, May 18th, 2023. Multipolarity.
The alliance formed in war and has flourished in peace. Seemingly every day, we've launched new areas of cooperation on cyber, strategic technologies, space, democracy.
Over the past century, we have faced many threats, but the U.S. has always led the world in defense of freedom.
In the conflict or competition between the U.S. and China for influence in the Indo-Pacific, you'll find several American allies in a difficult spot. They have important economic ties to Beijing, but decades-old military pacts with the United States, which aims to maintain its primacy in the region. Where does this leave South Korea, Japan, the Philippines? And what about North Korea and its nukes? American hegemony meets a multipolar world. Next, as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
The Indo-Pacific is the most dynamic and fastest growing region in the world. 50% of the world's population, 60% of global GDP, 8 of the top 15 U.S. export markets. It supports 3 million jobs here in the United States, provides about $900 billion in foreign direct investment to our country. And it's driven about 75% of global economic growth over the last 5 years. China, as it happens, invests a full 50% of its assistance and economic and diplomatic resources in the Indo-Pacific.
A long, long time ago.
Who knew Yoon could croon?
I still remember how the music used to make me smile.
At the state dinner at the White House in April, South Korea's President Yoon Suk Yeol sang one of his favorites, American Pie. And since I've never been any good at karaoke, I will reserve comment.
February made me shiver.
Yoon spent 6 days in Washington, during which he addressed Congress in a speech steeped in history. He invoked the U.S.-South Korea alliance forged in the Korean War and Syngman Rhee's dictatorship, and now 70 years later, a critical piece of the U.S. strategy to work with democratic allies to preserve American primacy in that part of the world.
The war ended after 3 years of intense battle. Our two nations signed the Mutual Defense Treaty and opened a new era of the alliance. Ever since, the Korean people rose from the ruins of war to build a thriving nation. And at every step, America has stood together with Korea.
As we're going to discuss in this episode, America's time as the sole superpower in East Asia is over. China's rise and its bilateral relationships with South Korea, North Korea, Japan, and other Indo-Pacific countries makes for a complicated picture, as does the relationship between, say, South Korea and Japan. The history of Japan's appalling abuse of Koreans during the Second World War and how to compensate for it continues to divide those countries to this day. But they are finding common cause to work together to deal with North Korea's incessant saber-rattling. All of this is why talk of a U.S.-China Cold War implies a kind of bipolarity that doesn't square with reality. During the U.S.-Soviet Cold War, many countries were either aligned with one superpower or the other. Today, a country like South Korea has deep ties to both China and the United States. And China's economy can hardly be described as communist. Secretary of State Antony Blinken seems to understand this, as he recently testified to Congress, as the U.S. exercises diplomatic and economic muscle in addition to military power projection, which did not serve the country all that well in 2 decades of war in the Middle East.
The post-Cold War era is over. There is an intense competition underway to shape what comes next. China represents the most consequential geopolitical challenge that we face today. A country with the intent and increasingly the capability to challenge our vision for a free, open, secure, and prosperous international order. We cannot dictate Beijing's path. We cannot wait for China to change its trajectory. But we can put ourselves in a position of strength to compete intensely, to shape the broader strategic environment around China, and to advance our vision. We do not seek conflict with China or a new Cold War. We're not trying to contain China. And in fact, the United States continues to have a comprehensive trade and investment relationship with China, as do most of our allies and partners. We are, however, resolutely for de-risking and diversifying, not decoupling.
To give you an idea of just how thorny this whole situation is, listen to this question President Biden was asked at a joint news conference he held with President Yoon. It deals with his policy on semiconductors and how that affects South Korea's relationship with China.
Thank you, Mr. President. Your top economic priority has been to build up U.S. domestic manufacturing in competition with China. But your rules against expanding chip manufacturing in China is hurting South Korean companies that rely heavily on Beijing. Are you damaging a key ally in the competition with China to help your domestic politics ahead of the election?
President Biden did not directly address the complications his policy might cause between China and South Korea. Here is part of his response.
My desire to increase U.S. manufacturing and jobs in America is not about China. I'm not concerned about China. Remember, America invented the semiconductor. We invented it. We used to have 40% of the market. And we decided that what we're going to do over the past, I don't know how many decades, we decided that it was going to be cheaper to export jobs and import product. And along came the pandemic. And the pandemic taught us that we used to have, as I said, 40% of the market just some years ago. Now it's down to 10%.
So let's talk multipolarity with Washington Times national security team leader Guy Taylor and Andrew Salmon, our reporter based in Seoul. Guy Taylor, welcome back to the show. Welcome back from your reporting trip to Korea.
Hi, Martin. Thank you so much. Glad to be here.
South Korea, and that is where we're joined by Andrew Salmon, the Washington Times Asia editor. Hello, Andrew. Nice to meet you, so to speak, over Zoom.
Hi, Martin. How are you?
And how long have you been with the Washington Times now?
This is my second stint. So I kicked off originally back in, I'm tempted to say 2002, 2003, and freelance for the Times for, about a decade. And then came back on board full-time, covering the region as of January the 1st.
Well, it's great to have you back. As I look at how the U.S.-China relationship is framed, I feel like the discourse, as with so many issues here in Washington, is becoming increasingly impoverished, often framed as a burgeoning conflict, or conflict is inevitable, or as a new Cold War, which of course evokes the memory of the U.S.-Soviet standoff. We're going to talk about whether that's a good way of looking at the world, but first, briefly, Guy Taylor, there was a bit of a thaw, if you will, last week, when for the first time in months, high-level U.S. and Chinese officials finally spoke face-to-face.
Right. Yeah, that was pretty important. The National Security Advisor for the Biden administration, Jake Sullivan, actually held direct talks with his counterparts in a neutral location, not in China, not in the United States, but in Europe. This was like a reestablishment or a restoration of public diplomacy between Washington and Beijing. Obviously, both sides have big embassies and whatnot, but in terms of publicized big talks and photo ops, this really was the first one since basically the G20 meeting a year ago between President Biden and President Xi Jinping. And remember, after that meeting, there was going to be a push to try to have more public diplomacy, more talks like this, to try and ease rising tensions between these two powers. But that plan got derailed with the alleged Chinese spy balloon incident in early February. And at that time, Antony Blinken was anticipated in Beijing, but he canceled his trip. So
that's right.
So this was a big deal that the NSC has signaled in the Biden administration they wanted to talk. They were ready to talk even after the spy balloon.
Yeah, President Biden has made overtures to Xi in recent weeks or months, but they've all been rebuffed by the Chinese president. Yeah, yes. It wasn't derailed, by the way, Guy. When you're dealing with a balloon, it was burst. The idea was burst. Sorry about that.
Very good.
But as I mentioned, the Cold War, a Cold War between the U.S. and China, implies a kind of bipolarity to the world order when we're witnessing very much a multipolar world. I'll just start with you, Andrew. How do you approach the issue of multipolarity in your reporting in this very important and massive part of the world?
It's multipolarity, but it's multidimensional, and it's also multi-domain. So let's look at it in a traditional sense. We'll look at the military issue. And there, I think the lines have been quite clearly drawn. China's a continental power. The US is a maritime power. The US is seeking to leverage its alliances on the maritime periphery of China. So that's from Japan up in the northeast through the Ryukyu chain down to Taiwan, and with the South Korea's Jeju Naval Base and its west coast on the Yellow Sea, past Taiwan down into the northern Philippines, which covers a key choke point between Taiwan and the PI, then across the South China Sea, up through the Malacca Strait, into the Andaman Sea, into the Bay of Bengal. This is the long series of island chains and strategic choke points. So this is one thing that strategically we can look at. But to expand the multipolarity, multidimensionality, you've got to look at trade and investment. And of course, pretty much every country in the region, off top of head, I think every country in the region, its main trade partner is China. So this is a massive break on American ambitions to contain China. But of course, America also does a ridiculous amount of trade with China. So are we in a Cold War where we're in a trade relationship or not? Of course, the key node in this trade war is in high tech, notably semiconductors. And of course, this is hugely problematic for South Korea, which is heavily invested in China, for Taiwan, which may surprise many people, is significantly invested in the Shenzhen semiconductor corridor in China, in Nanjing. Then there's not just trade, but investment. If we look at it from a macro perspective, in recent years, you'd have seen massive investment flooding into China, the workshop of the world. That's starting to change now. If we look at South Korea, for example, a lot of their investment is now shifting. If you look at their profile, they're deshoring away from China, reshoring to the US. And this is a big sort of macro trend that's notable. So I would look at it through those various lenses.
Guy Taylor, multipolarity.
Sure. I mean, I agree, actually, with Andy's characterization. I also, though, would try to simplify even more and say that while the U.S.-Soviet Cold War memories are of a bipolarity of the world order, the reality of what's occurring now is new, and it's between China and the United States that I think we could think of as a kind of a Cold War 2.0. And it's important to home in on the meaning of the 2.0 part, which is, I think, what Andy is doing, because there's some essential differences between the global geopolitical dynamics now between the U.S. and China and those of the U.S.-Soviet Cold War era. The first being the fact of economic entanglement between the U.S. and China. They are major trading partners bilaterally in a way the U.S. and the Soviet Union simply were not. And then the wider economic entanglement that finds China having massive bilateral trade relations with several countries that happen to be major security allies of the United States, specifically South Korea, Japan, and Australia, to name a few. And then, of course, this other dynamic is this, what you mentioned, this kind of multipolar world. Yes, there may be two dominant economic players, the U.S. and China, but the reality is there are several other nodes of dominance from Latin America to Africa, the Middle East, Europe, and of course the big one, India. So there is a Cold War 2.0 unfolding between the U.S. and China. It's unfolding within the context of these new realities. It's an economically entangled multipolar Cold War 2.0.
Yeah, so let's apply that then to the situation with South Korea, which historically has always found it difficult to please both the United States and China. So President Yoon was just here in Washington. He did the karaoke song there with President Biden.
Yeah.
Andrew, why was his visit here less well received in his own country?
Well, Yoon won the election last spring by cat's whisker, a very, very narrow margin indeed. And I think there's a strong sense here that, particularly on the left side of the political spectrum, that he's pushing too far, too fast in the direction of Japan, which is always a hugely emotive issue for Koreans.
Absolutely, because of
the
the history of World War II. But go on, yes.
Right, exactly. I mean, to you and I, this is history, but in many chunks of the Korean polity, World War II sort of ended, this morning. Memories are purposely kept very, very fresh.
Because of the forced labor and other issues. Yeah, go on.
Sure. And this is something that arguably China and North Korea have been able to leverage to drive the classic wedge between South Korea and Japan, ergo and the US as well. It's always been very, very tricky for the Americans to create any form of a sort of a trilateral alliance on the eastern flank of China. There's always two alliances, South Korea, Japan, which they have to juggle. Now, Yoon came to power with a pretty outspoken mandate. I'm going to improve relations with Japan, continue to improve relations, which weren't exactly bad, with the United States, because I think he truly is concerned about the rise of China and the fact that for all the efforts of the free world, the West, or the global North, whatever you want to call it, over decades, North Korea continues to move forward with its weapons of mass destruction programs. So, Yoon came into office with this mandate. He's pushing this mandate, and people are not entirely happy with it. This is a diverse democracy, and there is a legitimate voice that says we need better relations with China, better relations with North Korea. Yoon is very much better relations with Japan, better relations with the US. So it's an either-or issue, depending on which side of the spectrum you fall.
I think he says it very well. I think President Yoon is very different from President Moon, his predecessor, who was more or less a far-left human rights lawyer who wanted an appeasement policy toward North Korea, wanted a warming of relations in something that's long been referred to as the Sunshine Policy, which is to offer concessions to the North and maybe unclench one's fists trying to interact with North Korea. President Moon had a real time of it trying to pursue that policy with President Donald Trump in the White House in Washington. They actually found a lot of common ground because President Moon got behind Donald Trump's desire and pursuit to hold top-level one-on-one meetings or small group meetings with the North Korean leader. Yoon won an election in South Korea, and he's brought a very different approach to the table. He's much more of a conservative hawk on North Korea, and his calculus is that South Korea should be more closely partnered with the United States and Japan. The big piece of this is, what about China? How much does this posturing, this warming of relations between South Korea and Japan, and this increased three-way security alliance the Biden administration is promoting, how does that fit with the Chinese Communist government's reaction to all of that? Because while Japan and South Korea might be willing to embrace this or pursue it as a thing that's focused on the North Korean nuclear threat, the United States sees this three-way alliance as not only being a response to North Korea, but very much being about countering China as well.
Well, when Yoon came to power, Guy, he floated the idea, suggested that it might be time for South Korea to develop its own nuclear weapons, but he's walked away from that a little bit, and then we had this Washington declaration with his meeting with Biden recently. So what's the status then now of South Korea's defense posture or its vision for its own defense? Because there seems to be a sense in South Korea that America's commitment to the treaty signed way back in 1953 might be lagging.
The Washington Declaration was a concession by South Korea to publicly say they would adhere to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which we can interpret to mean that they will not pursue their own nuclear weapons arsenal.
That's right.
The United States has long held to a posture of wanting to keep Japan a pacifist nation that does not pursue nuclear weapons and to prevent a nuclear arms race between North Korea and South Korea and anyone else in the region. So the United States has also wanted South Korea not to say publicly it would not pursue its own nuclear weapons. Number two, the Biden administration in exchange said we will create a NATO-style, and they didn't call it this, but if you look at NATO agreements between the United States and countries that have done these nuclear consultative groups, the United States made the somewhat unprecedented move in Northeast Asia of saying we want to create a new nuclear consultative group with South Korea, essentially to share intelligence on any nuclear weapons moves that the United States might be considering or about to make in a confrontation specifically with North Korea. There was no mention of China. The second thing that the Biden administration said was that it would deploy a nuclear weapons-armed submarine to the Korean peninsula, to South Korea, for the first time in 40 years. This is a significant announcement.
And that's about North Korea, right?
That is how the announcement announcement was made, and that is what the South Koreans, my interpretation. Now we're getting into speculation, all right? But if we look at the facts, that's what the Washington Declaration was.
So, Andrew, to my earlier point about the historic difficulty of South Korea trying to keep good relations with both China and the United States. What's your sense of public sentiment there about their relationship with the U.S.? It seems that, at least according to some poll data I read, South Koreans aren't all that happy with the relationship, want more autonomy in their foreign policy or independence in their foreign policy.
I'm not sure if I might have seen a different poll to you. You know, in recent years, and this has been consistent, there's a think tank here called the Asan Institute, which was founded by one of the scions of the Hyundai dynasty. It's got some pretty smart people working for it. And every year they do a survey of South Korean public attitudes towards the US and towards the US alliance. And just in the last few years, I mean, support for the alliance has been up in the, 80, 90% range. It's been really, really high. Conversely, what we have seen is in the last 2 years, a number of public findings have discovered that the least liked nation among all South Koreans is no longer Japan, the traditional bête noire due to colonial rule in the first half of the 20th century. It's now China. So there's been a shift, there's been a swing in South Korean public opinion. And I think people are starting to get a little bit frightened, which wasn't really the case 10, 20 years ago.
Let me just interject. There was a survey done by Seoul-based Che Institute for Advanced Studies. Found about 50% of respondents said they doubted Washington would fight for South Korea.
That's a different, right. That's the other issue. Okay,
at the risk of a North Korean nuclear attack. I mean, we're talking a lot about U.S.-China here, but much of these issues deal with North Korea's threats.
Let's talk about North Korean nukes and possibly South Korean nukes. The issue that comes up when you go to conferences again and again and again is the question that de Gaulle posed to Kennedy, which is, if push came to shove, would you be prepared to sacrifice New York to save Paris? And we don't know what the answer to that is. Fortunately, that has never happened. And since the continued increase in North Korean capabilities, but most particularly tactical nuclear weapons rather than strategic nuclear weapons and short-range rocket and artillery systems, these are weapons of use rather than non-use. And they're starting to make South Koreans nervous. And that, I think, is why, as per the findings you just quoted me from the Che Institute, I think this is why South Koreans are starting to get nervous. Under Trump, there was a sense that perhaps Americas are not as shackled to this alliance as we'd like them to be. And similarly, North Korea is looking more and more aggressive. So should we consider our own nuclear capabilities? And there are a number of researchers and think tanks. I spoke to Chung Mong-jun, the former head of Hyundai Heavy Industries, who's also a retired politician, at a conference last year and said, Tim, what's your position on this? And he said, look, we need to have our own nukes. How can we sleep in our beds at night? That's literally what he said. This is a discussion that's taking place here.
Well, that's an explosive issue, no pun intended, because North Korea would view such a move as offensive, not defensive.
Well, would it? There is an argument, as Winston Churchill said, every country should have an English Channel. By the same logic, maybe every country should have a nuclear weapon. That would obviate conventional invasions. There's a theory here that if South Korea decided to withdraw from the NPT, and there is a clause in the NPT which says that if you have a very specific reason, you can do so without censure. People in the European Union say that, South Korea has a legitimate reason. If South Korea decided it had to go nuclear, could it maintain its alliance with the US in the same way that, say, the UK has?
That question has been pushed aside because of the Washington Declaration for the time being. And that's what the significance of the South Korean concession of saying we will adhere to the NPT and we will not pursue our own nuclear weapons. That's the significance of it.
No argument with that, but I can assure you this discussion continues.
So Guy Taylor, for the longest time, during the Cold War, China wanted to exercise influence over North Korea to keep it out of the Soviet orbit. Does China exercise any influence over North Korea and all of its saber-rattling that we've seen in recent years? I mean, what is the check on North Korean ambitions right now? Because it's been doing a lot of missile tests, and there's a possibility it might do another detonation, right? Test detonation.
Sure. Raising history here is very important. I'm not sure I agree with your characterization of China's motivations for its alliance with North Korea vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, but a couple of things to remember historically if we go back just 80 years. People need to remember that Imperial Japan, occupied the Korean Peninsula and did so in an incredibly aggressive manner that involved war crimes that had led to historical acrimony between Koreans north and south and the Japanese. So that's a contextual point that's very important. Second very important piece is that China and North Korea are mutual defense treaty allies. This is often overlooked. North Korea does not have a mutual defense clause in treaties with any other country. China is the main ally of North Korea. The relationship is complicated, however, because North Korea is not simply a vassal state or a client state of China. It's a completely independent country that is also paranoid of being overwhelmed and over-influenced by its much larger, more powerful neighbor, China. But remember the historical connection between China and North Korea. When the Soviet Union was backing the origins of the Kim regime in Pyongyang, so was Mao Zedong's emergent communist China. Mao Zedong's own son died fighting on the North Korean side against U.S.-backed South Korean and U.S. and South Korean forces. So when it comes to understanding the complexities of the China-North Korea relationship now and whether or not China could be relied upon by Washington as a partner to perhaps dissuade a seventh North Korean nuclear detonation test or to perhaps convince North Korean leader Kim Jong-un to sit down for some kind of multi-party or one-on-one talks with either South Korea or the United States towards possible denuclearization. It's really a complicated and heavily debated question. I ran an article in the Times about 2 weeks ago. There was an interview with the former CIA director and Secretary of State, Michael Pompeo. And Pompeo, who was in the middle of the Trump-era push to try and do something with the North Koreans, get a deal, talk to them, his argument is that the West would do well to look at the China and North Korean nuclear programs and activities as one in the same, and that Washington should hold a posture of holding China as responsible as it holds North Korea for any North Korean nuclear provocations. This is obviously a very simplified argument, and Mike Pompeo is no longer the CIA director or the Secretary of State, and he's written a book and can talk openly with reporters about these things with less consequence than, say, the current Secretary of State. However, it's a very interesting argument and statement coming from someone who sat multiple times in one-on-one talks with Kim Jong-un, who has met his counterparts in Beijing and worked with the Chinese as well, and really understands, has a view of the dynamic between Beijing and Pyongyang that's somewhat unique and more informed than most people.
Mike Pompeo really threw the cat among the pigeons with this statement. It's been conventional wisdom here that North Korea is almost entirely reliant upon China for, you name it, fuel, medicines, cross-border trade, etc. And they don't like it. Who would want to be so dependent upon a single player, right?
That's why I'm curious as to what extent China can use some of its leverage over North Korea to stop.
Right. The only leverage I think they've actually applied in recent years, and I think this was during remember the old six-party talks, which were sort of sponsored by Beijing, and Pyongyang joined very, very reluctantly to jog them along. The Chinese allegedly cut for a very, very brief period of time the single fuel pipeline from China into North Korea, which goes along the bed of the Amnok-gang or the Yalu River, which is the de facto border in the northwest of North Korea. But I'm told by engineers that it is the nature of these pipelines. You can't turn these things off for long. If you do, and I don't claim to be a fuel engineer, but if you do, the thing kind of gums up and causes all kind of problems. So this is something they haven't done or can't do very often. And North Korea, their founding principle was juche, which is doing things for yourself, being self-sufficient, being independent. And this resonates with them. All that having been said, whether they like it or not, they are dependent upon China for very, very much. And even if they don't like it, and this is, one interesting phrase that gets thrown around in Seoul coffee shops when you're talking with North Korean experts, is that when Kim Jong-il first tested a nuclear device back in 2006, and this thing sort of went bang, and it's been successful, he turned around and said to his aides and flunkies and scientists, fantastic. Now we don't have to bow to those Chinese sons of bitches.
I want to just add another piece to that it's well known in Seoul and in Washington and in Tokyo and in most European capitals where this is being watched, that the Chinese government does not fully enforce, despite sitting on the UN Security Council as a permanent member, the Chinese government has a pretty strong track record of not fully enforcing UN Security Council economic sanctions on North Korea. And in fact, China is the biggest buyer of North Korean coal. While the rest of the world upholds these UN sanctions, China is able to buy this coal at cut rate prices, under the table black market deals with North Korea, and that coal is used predominantly to power China's steel making plants, and China is the number one producer of steel in the human species. So there's another layer to it that's an economic relationship that's often overlooked.
Most, if not all, of these countries we're talking about here want to have an autonomous or an independent foreign policy. As far as I see it, the strategy of the U.S. right now is to catch up with China. China in the 90s and the early aughts began making, and did so very successfully, economic and political inroads with the nations in its neighborhood.
I think it's a misnomer and a mischaracterization to say that the U.S. is trying to catch up with China in terms of investment in these countries. In fact, if you look at South Korea, the Chinese represent about 4% of foreign direct investment into South Korea, whereas Japan and the United States together account for about 40% of foreign direct investment. The Chinese have, however, opened their massive consuming market to several smaller, weaker economies in the region. For example, Vietnam, the Philippines is another example. That big market in China is also incredibly enticing, appealing. It's almost like a drug for the South Korean and Japanese economies, because remember, the South Koreans are selling far more goods into China than they are to the U.S., Canada, Mexico market. So this is the economic complexity that we're talking about.
Andrew, you want to address that issue that the U.S. is seeking to bolster its alliances and also economic, political, diplomatic ties with its partners in the face of the rising China?
Short answer, yes. Long answer,
you can give short answers too. Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, I can leave it at that if you like. Long answer, show me any country in the world that's got a truly sovereign policy in anything. We live in a modern, very sophisticated, interconnected world in every area, from communications to trade to investment to defense to diplomacy to media, whatever it may be. And so this idea of sovereignty and independence I think is a political rallying cry rather than a realistic aspiration.
I do have an issue with the framing of U.S.-China conflict. It's inevitable. It's a Cold War. But there is something to that. These nations we've been discussing do want assistance from the U.S. in the face of what is called Chinese economic coercion. In my preparation for this conversation we're having here, I read a bunch of articles about the way China has used economic coercion to get its way with these countries if it feels these countries move too close to the United States.
This is all over the place. It's not just economic. With South Korea, that was the Achilles heel. The Lotte Group, one of the biggest groups in South Korea, global brand, very, very big in retail. They had to close their operations in China after 2017 when there was a massive dispute between Seoul and Beijing over the stationing of a U.S. missile defense system, THAAD.
THAAD.
THAAD, the Terminal High Area Defense.
High Altitude
Area Defense, I think, which of course has these extraordinary powerful radars, which may well be aimed at North Korea now, but two guys and a screwdriver, they look into Northeast China. There's no question about this. You know, it's also military coercion. If you move to the South China Sea, look at the Philippines. They don't have a naval capability. They don't really have a naval capability. China is building absolutely massive bases on disputed reefs and islets down there. But funnily enough, so are Southeast Asian nations. The problem for the Philippines doesn't have Chinese economic muscle. So if you look at I think it's the closest base in one of the disputed reefs, I think it's Mischief Reef, I may be mistaken. Their base, compared to China, which has got runways, ammunition storage, bunkers, full docks for warships, their base is a beached sort of World War II era submarine chaser with 6 Marines aboard it. So, of course, if you're the Philippines, you've got this disputed territorial issue with China, you're going to love the Americans to come in and help you out. This makes perfect sense.
I think it's very important to look out beyond just East Asia. Okay, China-U.S. Cold War-style competition is playing out in several South American nations, in more than a dozen African nations, in several nations of the Middle East. It's playing out in Europe, and it's playing out in different ways in each place. Most predominantly, it's economic muscle flexing. It's Chinese loans for infrastructure development, loans that countries are incapable of paying back. China has offered these loans because of economic interest in Beijing for access to things like precious metals, minerals, and energy in these countries. The United States struggles to compete with those loans with its aid-based system that successive administrations have been trying to reform to make more competitive for foreign direct investment in places like sub-Saharan Africa or the Congo Basin. What I want to also point out is there is a military aspect to this global competition as well. While the United States maintains the most connected and active network of powerful military bases around the world, there really are few competitors on the world stage, and China is clearly emerging as one. And the list of bases is smaller, but the list of bases potentially in development is far more than any other competitor. And I'll point to the Chinese base in Djibouti in the Horn of Africa, point to Chinese military access to Sri Lanka's main naval port, point to Chinese access to Pakistan's main naval ports. This involves the Indian Ocean. This involves access into East Asia, up into the South China Sea, through which a very large amount of global trade passes. So I think we have to look beyond just East Asia and realize that there is an element of bipolarity at play here in terms of who are the organizations of humans, the biggest governments, chaotic democratic United States, and what some would argue, and I know I'll get emails about this, but almost like a monolithic Chinese communist autocratic system that's almost in this Cold War style clash.
I love getting listener emails, Guy, but go ahead, Andrew.
Just for the word monolithic, because people don't think that the Chinese Communist Party is monolithic, and I often make that statement, and then someone comes up to me afterwards and says, you don't understand. Yeah.
We can debate monoliths on the next episode. Go ahead, Andrew.
Let me add, look at this from the point of view, if you're a nation in the global south, you're in South Asia, you're in sub-Saharan Africa, you're in LATAM, you're in the Pacific Islands, and you've got a choice between the US, Western European finance and aid packages. These are going to come with a lot of rules, regulations. They're going to come with a lot of oversight. The Chinese will come in. They're very, very good at the hardware. They can do the construction. And I'm sorry to tell you this, the airports I've been to in China are actually far better than the ones I've been to in the US. Let that point sink in.
I just learned recently that China's building high-speed rail in Indonesia.
Exactly. Their high-speed rail net is superb. Their highway network is superb. I mean, if you go to, I don't know, Dandong, Shanghai, Beijing, their public toilets are pretty good. So the whole range of infra is really up and coming. They've actually overinvested in it massively, which is hugely problematic for them, as we now know. But nevertheless, they're good at building infra. So again, if you're a nation in the global south and you're looking at, who am I going to go to build my port, my road, my airport, the Chinese will actually offer you a pretty good deal. And if it costs you some mines, some precious metals, that's not a bad thing.
That's what I meant before by the U.S. having to catch up, even though I wasn't totally accurate in the way I framed that question, as Guy added. But yeah.
So the Chinese, I think they've realized that we don't have soft power. We don't have Hollywood. We don't have K-pop. We're not an attractive nation in that sense. We don't have a pull for people, but, we can throw our money around. We're good with shovel, pick, and hammer. We can build stuff for you. And this is a significant part of their...
Yeah, they're not trying to export their ideology or government.
No, this is where I think we have to get back to. If we're framing this conversation as a discussion about a potential Cold War, or that's the way to characterize the tension between the United States and China in 2023, I think we have to ask ourselves, if you had to choose between fast trains, nice airports, and public toilets, and a free press or freedom of religion. Remember that the U.S. State Department, along with several European and other governments around the world, have announced publicly that they believe that the Chinese communist-ruled government is carrying out a genocide against Uyghur Muslims inside northwest China, and that it's been going on for years. And there's not any outside or internal, unmonitored, uncontrolled press reporting on this inside China. I think these questions are important. No free press in China, persecution of religious groups, and this is something at the core of the democratic world, the world of democracies that are aligned with the United States, whether they're NATO members or they're security allies or economic allies or pacifist countries that want freedom, and then getting your airport and your port, but then finding out that in fact you owe a great deal of money back to that government and you cannot pay it back, and there's pressure from that government for you to hand over things like your biggest port or your biggest copper mine. This is where the sausage is being made within this Cold War type of narrative that we're experiencing.
Well, if President Biden, Guy, has a doctrine, as we've discussed in past episodes, it is this. As he has said, the Chinese and other autocratic or authoritarian governments across the globe want you to believe that democracy had its day and that their model of doing business is the way of the future.
I think we're in a contest, not with China per se, but a contest with autocratic governments around the world, as whether or not democracies can compete with them in the rapidly changing 21st century.
Let me be brutally cynical. If you look across the world, if you look at the global south, do you think that they share these democratic values, freedom, fairness, rule of law, freedom of speech, freedom of association? Possibly not. Many of them don't. If you're building the Karakoram Highway and you're a Pakistani leader, do you really want freedom of religion?
But I guess Guy's point is these nations then find out that the bargain doesn't always work out to their benefit.
No, and I think it's country by country, and I think that you find that the majority of countries want both. They want to have their own decision on whether to have freedom of press, freedom of religion, and they also want help and support from wealthier nations in the world in developing infrastructure and economic connectivity. And that, in my own mind, that is the challenge facing the United States and its allies right now, is how to deliver both efficiently and quickly. And that's really the discussion about things like the Development Finance Corporation that was created during the Trump era. That's the discussion about the Blue Dot Network, is trying to get wealthy allied democracies to put up the money quickly for countries that need it without strings attached.
I do think Andrew has a point, however. There are countries who don't care about those human rights and freedom issues. That's why they do find the Chinese offers attractive. There aren't strings attached. So only fools try to predict the future, but I'm going to ask you both to predict the future. What might happen to this complex set of relationships we've been discussing if North Korea detonates another bomb? They test plenty of missiles, but it's been a while since they've detonated a nuke, a test obviously.
I'll say two things. My personal opinion is changes nothing. They've detonated 6, they've detonated 7th, so what? That having been said, I and my colleagues were briefed late last year by a very senior South Korean official on background who said, this time it's going to be different. This won't be 6+1. There's going to be a much more serious response. He wouldn't say what that was, and thus far, every effort to trammel the North Korean nuclear and weapons of mass destruction programs, delivery programs, has failed. But that was a point he made very, very clearly. And I would add, what kind of nuclear test are we talking? And thus far, we've been looking at sort of strategic devices. What if this is a tactical nuclear device? That brings a different dynamic to the entire battle space of the Korean Peninsula. Moreover, what if they decide not to do it underground as they have in the past, but do an atmospheric nuclear test? That would be a game changer. I wouldn't like to say how the world would respond, but as a cynic and a pessimist, I'll say I don't think we are in control of North Korea's destiny.
Yeah, it depends on the context. I totally agree with Andy. How big of a test are we talking? How many intercontinental ballistic missiles are tested at the same time? What is the scope of the test? I think the Biden administration has similarly said that there would be an incredibly aggressive response from the U.S. and its allies, but not specified what that is. Although the Biden administration has made the somewhat preemptive move of already announcing the deployment of this nuclear weapons-armed submarine to the Korean Peninsula. And then finally, let's go back and remember after the 2017 nuclear detonation by the North, that was their 6th test. Right after that test, we heard the famous line from Donald Trump that if the North Koreans didn't stop doing these provocations, that they would meet fire and fury like the world has never seen. I think it's important to realize that the North Koreans heard that statement in a way that the U.S. media did not. It was portrayed here as in a different light. And they heard it and they still hear it. They're watching American democracy very carefully. They don't know if there'll be a Republican administration back in the White House that embraces that posture. And it still resonates. So, yeah, the possibility of a more aggressive response than we've ever seen from the United States, South Korea, Japan, and other allies, and possibly we don't know what the reaction of China would be. It's all, and I do think it all depends on the scope of the test. So there's a lot of factors and variables at play.
I'm not sure what can be done. Economic warfare is already in place, as Guy mentioned. China helps North Korea evade sanctions. This is an enormously difficult situation.
You could see a re-escalation of the U.S.-China trade war with the United States Treasury Department working specifically with the European Union to try and impose trade sanctions on China, but then also target what are called secondary sanctions, where they would use North Korea as the justification to carry out so-called secondary sanctions against Chinese banks that do business for the Kim government in Pyongyang, which would punish Chinese businesses in a way that could really anger Beijing. Those types of sanctions have actually been announced by the U.S. Treasury Department before, but there's almost no example of them being enforced. And the more hawkish voices and analysts on North Korea policy and in Washington argue regularly for whoever's in the White House to get serious about imposing such secondary sanctions targeting China.
Well, that's more escalation. That's not de-escalation. Maybe it's warranted, but
economic escalation, right? Yeah, which fits within the Cold War context of what we're talking about.
Let me just tell you a very, very short story from the very first North Korean nuclear test. Within days of that happening back in 2006, the Japanese foreign minister at the time flew into Seoul for emergency discussions. I actually can't remember who it was at the time, but he invited several of the foreign correspondents at the time to have a discussion at the Lotte Hotel in Seoul on background. And my first question was, look, North Korea's gone critical. When is Japan going to test? And he said, oh, no, we're not going to test. I said, fair enough. And as soon as the foreign minister left the room, we all looked at each other and said, well, in that case, China has no real need to stamp down on North Korea. This is going to continue. And sure enough, it has.
Andrew Salmon, based in Seoul, Guy Taylor, based in Washington. My Washington Times colleagues' work covering the U.S., China, East Asia range of issues can be found at WashingtonTimes.com. And make sure you sign up for Guy's weekly newsletter, Threat Status. And you can sign up for my newsletter at historyasithappens.com. On the next episode of History as It Happens, we're going to talk about a poorly understood, overlooked, yet relevant aspect of Martin Luther King's legacy, his embrace of socialism. That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.